I'm on the podcast feed early this week, and yes, I've adjusted our release schedule just a bit. After talking with people, I felt it would be more interesting to start our discussion on Avengers Campus, the new land at Disney's California Adventure, just before it opens, and then continue that discussion after it opens. For Bandcamp members, I'm going to bump back our discussion of the 1965 opening of Great Moments by a few days. But in this series, on the eve of the opening of Avengers Campus, I want to look at how the Disney parks arrived at a point where they could include Avengers Campus based on films far outside the tones of traditional Disney fare, and also look at how the design, narrative, and ride elements would continue to change the feel of Disney parks, particularly in California. We'll look at these topics in a few chunky episodes starting today. Avengers Campus, Part 1. For decades, in fact for most of my childhood, the Disney parks were solely focused on presenting experiences related to films and TV shows produced by Disney. In the 1950s, long before I was born, there was the occasional sighting of the Lone Ranger, a character outside of the Disney films, in Frontierland. But for the most part, the stories in the park related to a limited set of films and original experiences, all of which shared certain core values in terms of narrative, a strategy that possibly could have continued indefinitely. The initial underlying problem was that during the 1970s and early 1980s, the Disney studio wasn't producing material that would be a strong basis for park attractions. There were a set of films such as The Black Hole, which lent themselves to park attractions. DHI even mocked up concepts for Black Hole, but these films underperformed at the box office, meaning that they didn't have the audience base and interest to drive a centerpiece attraction. There were a large group of Disney films, mostly zany comedies such as Gus, Candleshoe, The Cat from Outer Space, that were arranged as stories directed almost wholly at younger viewers and that also didn't have the audience base for an expensive attraction. The really bright spot for the Disney studio in the early 1980s was with a set of serious dramas, such as Never Cry Wolf, Night Crossing, Amy, and Tex. But as these were dramas, they also didn't lend themselves to theme park attractions. As a side note, the two best films on that list, which are Never Cry Wolf and Night Crossing, are not yet up on Disney Plus and would be fabulous ads if anyone over at the direct-to-consumer unit happens to be listening. At Disneyland, the real mixing of IPs didn't begin until the 1980s, and the mixing was designed to solve that practical problem. If the Disney studio with its theatrical output wasn't producing the right kinds of movies that would support new theme park attractions, where then might Imagineering look for new properties or even performers to integrate into the park? The initial inclusion was an obvious choice: Star Wars and Star Tours. Next was the 4D film Captain EO. Captain EO was developed largely in-house, but it used music and performance-style video that was far more in line with the traditions of Michael Jackson than that of Disney features. And then Indiana Jones as a stunt show in Florida and The Wizard of Oz as the finale for the Great Movie Ride. But in these inclusions, particularly with Star Wars, there's a very strong overlap in terms of storytelling strategies between the new properties and traditional Disney films. We'll get into that in a few minutes. But Star Wars and Indy essentially dissolved the idea that a Disney park would feature either attractions based on Disney films or attractions based on original ideas such as Pirates of the Caribbean that were developed solely for the park. After the Indiana Jones stunt spectacular, there was a wave of outside IP that then entered the parks, some of which was a better fit than others. The Muppets, Twilight Zone, for a while both the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and the Power Rangers were at Hollywood Studios. Aerosmith also probably belongs on this list, and for 2 years, R.L. Stine had a stage show based on his Goosebump characters at Hollywood Studios. Again, some of these were a better fit into the narrative framework of Disney parks, adding to the established mood, while others detracted from it. The concerns of IP mixing, or what is on-brand or off-brand to maintain the established tones of a Disney experience, are more strongly tied to the American parks. The Disney parks overseas, particularly in Hong Kong and Shanghai, have more leeway in terms of how the public identifies what makes a Disney attraction. The culture around these parks in Asia sees Disney as offering more movie-like experiences in general, whereas in the US, the Disney parks represent a certain flavor of movie-like experiences. In Hong Kong, for example, the Disney park there used to host Halloween mazes, featuring the scarier elements from the Disney films, the dungeon from Sleeping Beauty, Sid's deformed creations from Toy Story, the Mad Hatter from the Tim Burton version of Alice in Wonderland, and Pinocchio, with his wrists and ankles chained to a stage. And yes, you heard that right. Pinocchio with ankle cuffs attaching him to Stromboli's stage. One year there was even this. The Mad Hatter, after fitting his guest with various hats, pretended to decapitate them as well. Welcome to Disneyland, Hong Kong style. In part, I think this deep branding in the U.S. is tied to both the long history that the Disney parks have enjoyed in the States and also to Walt Disney, who himself for years on his TV show, while introducing that week's segment, also set up expectations as to how the materials on his show were different from those on many other TV shows. That type of cultural delineation didn't happen as deeply overseas, particularly in parts of Asia. But this wave of IP mixing in the US with Star Wars and Indy over years created a path that eventually led to entire lands, not just single attractions, being developed around properties that, at least initially, were developed outside of Disney, such as Pandora, Galaxy's Edge, and now Avengers Campus. At DCA, the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror closed in January 2017 to be transformed into Mission Breakout, an attraction themed to the Marvel property Guardians of the Galaxy. In terms of the California resort, beyond superhero meet and greets and small events, this was the first large and permanent step toward integrating the stories of Marvel into the American parks. Even at this time, as the one attraction was announced, Disney admitted that the retheming of the Tower ride would, quote, anchor a broader universe of superheroes that will grow over time in Disney's California adventure. During these months, most of the public discussion was focused on how the adult humor, comic book violence, and general irreverence of both Marvel Comics and Marvel movies would fit into a resort that identified with kid-friendly values and often used images of Sleeping Beauty's castle and Dumbo's flying elephants in its advertisements. Joe Rohde, who oversaw the retheming of the tower, said, quote, "There is a lot of irreverence in the story. It is distinctly an expansion of our style within this park, both in vocabulary and presentation. I think it's really nicely consistent with the mood and the tone and the feeling of what the Guardians are." But he also acknowledged that this was a departure. Quote, "You make a choice," he said, "and you do it." One of the design experiences that identifies Disney parks is the concept of uniquely themed environments. In Galaxy's Edge, for example, guests wander through Batuu. In Cars Land, guests enter a recreation of Radiator Springs. But the Marvel properties, in large part, present visions of our own world, of contemporary cities. And before I get tons of hate mail, yes, there's Asgard, now destroyed, the various locations visited by Star-Lord such as Vermeer, and the realms of Doctor Strange. But the majority of the action and the lives of the characters are centered on Earth. This is also a challenge. To create a believable Avengers Campus, Disney wouldn't necessarily transport you to a unique fantasy environment, but would take you to an urban center that resembles New York or Los Angeles or London. At the Hong Kong resort, designers were able to sidestep this issue a little. If you've been listening to our series on the Book of Hench, you already know that for the last decade of Walt's life, he used Tomorrowland as a place to showcase new technologies that could change the American city. There was the House of the Future, which guests could tour, the all-wig monorail, arranged as a model transportation system, and though we aren't yet up to this point in the Book of Hench, the Wedway People Mover. That is, during Walt's lifetime, he used Tomorrowland as an exposition center to showcase new technologies. When Imagineering added an Iron Man attraction to Hong Kong Disneyland, designers simply presented Tony Stark as a latter-day Walt Disney, who was showing off a new invention. The Imagineering lead who oversaw that project, Ted Robeldo, put it this way, quote, "So if Tony Stark came up with a flying tour vehicle and wanted to showcase some new technology, it's not too far-fetched to believe that he'd choose Hong Kong and choose Hong Kong Disneyland." In Hong Kong, the adult language, irreverence, and level of sarcasm in Marvel films was toned down for the in-park attraction. Iron Man was still Iron Man, but perhaps it was a version of Iron Man who knew that the kids were watching. But that larger concern, how do you merge a themed area that looks like an urban landscape with other areas that are drawn on fantasy, history, and science fiction? Or how do you entice guests to enjoy an environment that for many looks like a downtown street where they might work? Imagineer Joe Quesada explained, quote, "Marvel uses the real world as a canvas." Imagineering, in an attempt to replicate the visual setting of the movies, took field trips to local environments to get the feel for a campus, their materials, their colors, their textures. According to Imagineer Heidi Rosenthal, who worked with color design and field art direction, quote, "We will take field trips to college campuses or over to JPL. Areas of Avengers Campus resemble manufacturing buildings and warehouses with exposed pipes and beams. Quote, "We've been able to use the real," Rosenthal added, "and weave it into our story. But maybe, possibly, there might also be an upside to this problem as well. The threats that are experienced in Batuu or Pandora exist in a world far from our home, but the threats experienced in Avengers Campus might have a slightly higher felt sense of danger, as they involve a world nearly identical to the one we inhabit in our daily lives. Or in terms of design challenges, think of it this way. The familiar Disney equation uses placemaking to establish a large part of the wonder. We move through Batuu, its shops, its alcoves, its streets, manned by stormtroopers, and then eventually we fly the Falcon or are kidnapped onto a Star Destroyer. The initial signal that we're in a place charged with narrative possibilities is the presentation of the land with elaborately observed details. Avengers Campus won't be able to use placemaking in the same way to initiate the experience of wonder. Avengers Campus will look like a chunk of big city America. Its challenge will be different than those other designers have approached in the parks. Can attractions and other experiences transform a familiar urban landscape so that even there, guests experience a sense of wonder similar to that in Cars Land or Galaxy's Edge? In ways, this problem was front and center as artists started design work on the land. The answer at that time was focused on play. Quote, "How do we participate?" according to Scott Drake, was a question that framed much of those early talks. But one of the outcomes that we've seen with Galaxy's Edge is that even if role-playing is a central concern of a land, only a small portion of guests will engage that type of play. In Galaxy's Edge, maybe 10%, maybe 15% of the guests are engaged in a type of participatory play. The rest mostly want a type of passive entertainment, to get on the ride, enjoy the experience, and then to get a Ronto wrap for lunch. Play is also expensive to orchestrate. It requires professionals to engage guests, such as stormtroopers, Rey, Chewie, and the general residents of Batuu. Over the past 2 years, the initial ambitions to establish Galaxy's Edge as a type of role-playing environment have mostly shifted over to the Star Wars Hotel, now being built next to Hollywood Studios. So even though the idea of interactive play may have framed early talks, I don't think that this will likely be the solution, as labor to create that type of participatory experience is likely outside of the park's financial ability at the moment, especially after the pandemic. Play in a limited sense may frame an attraction or experience, such as we as guests on the ride get to play with Spider-Man-like abilities, and kids will be able to train with Black Panther's elite guards. But play in a larger sense is not going to, by itself, overcome the larger design issues in terms of how does an environment that looks like real-world America then engage guests with a deep sense of wonder. I'm writing this a few days before Avengers Campus opens. I'll visit DCA later this week during its opening weekend. And in the following episode, I'll include a segment about what I actually see at Avengers Campus. But at least at this point, let me just point out that I see this as a central challenge for Avengers Campus. Hong Kong simply made the Iron Man attraction fall in line with the old Disney-style expo attractions. But a full land, such as in California, with its architecture and hardscape, will be a little more difficult to integrate. This is going to be not only a challenge for DCA, where Avengers Campus is right next to Cars Land, but also for Disneyland Paris, where a slightly different version of this land will have the Web Slingers attraction and Rock and Roller Coaster, now rethemed to Iron Man. The Paris version of the Avengers Campus, due to the pandemic, was bumped from 2021 to early 2022. But I wouldn't be surprised if this was delayed again, or if portions of the Paris version came on in stages. The retheming of the existing roller coaster will be easier to complete than the new show building necessary for the Spider-Man-based Web Slingers ride. The Paris parks are presently closed, and I'm unsure how far behind schedule the resort is presently in this area. There's also another immediate issue with Marvel properties in the park, and that is familiarity. Some Disney movies have become a childhood rite of passage, Snow White in particular. Designers can expect guests at the U.S. parks to have some familiarity with storylines and rides in Fantasyland. I should also point out that for the Shanghai park, this is not the case. But in the U.S., the vast majority of guests know Snow White, Alice, Sleeping Beauty along with their stories. This is also true for Star Wars. Most older kids and teens in the U.S. have some exposure to Star Wars through film, the animated series, The Mandalorian, or maybe some comic books. But Marvel is a little more hit and miss. I recently had weekly conversations with a friend to talk him through WandaVision. By far the best known of the Marvel characters is Spider-Man. It's hard to imagine that many people didn't have some exposure growing up to Spidey, either in the comics, the animated series, or the 3 sets of movies. Spider-Man also showed up for a while on Sesame Street. My guess, Spider-Man was a very good pick for a first brand new built-from-the-ground-up ride in Avengers Campus. But beyond Spider-Man, in terms of large familiarity, it's a fairly steep drop. A good number of people will recognize Iron Man, Thor, and Hulk, but then another step down to the Scott Lang version of Ant-Man, Star-Lord, Gamora, and Bucky Barnes. And then another step down to Pietro, Ultron, Valkyrie, and so on. Then to include these characters and attractions, their stories would then need to be immediately understandable to any guest who walked into the park, whether they'd read the comics, watched the films, or couldn't tell you the difference between Doc Ock, Doctor Strange, Dr. Banner, Dr. Hank McCoy, Dr. Pym, or Dr. Doom. Other than there must be some pretty strange doctoral granting institutions in the U.S. For these attractions to work for a large audience, the story or ride experience must be easy to grasp for those with little to no knowledge of the Marvel Universe. The retheming of the Tower of Terror presented a story focused on some mid to minor characters in the Marvel Universe. The Collector captured the Guardians and is presenting them in zoo-like enclosures as part of his personal Museum of Wonders. One of them Rocket the Raccoon has escaped, and in the pre-show asks guests for their help in freeing his friends. From this angle, the story requires that guests have at least some knowledge of the Collector, Rocket, Star-Lord, Drax, and so on, unless you simply look at this as a conventional breakout narrative. For those with little experience in the Marvel Universe, ex-Imagineer Joe Rohde believed that guests could understand this ride as a set of archetypes. Quote, arrogant rich guy collector, and really funny, irreverent, slightly anti-hero characters. I like them, I don't like them, we're going to help them out. And even if that story, arranged as a set of archetypes, is a bit of a reach, there's still a lot of exciting drops set to a rock soundtrack from the 1970s inside the ride. In September 2018, the Bugs Land section of DCA closed for good. Most rides were removed, though one was redressed to an inside-out theme and placed in the Pixar Pier section of the park. The new land was arranged to come online in phases. The first ride would be an adaptation of the ride system and gameplay of Toy Story Mania, a 3D video game, essentially where guests shoot at objects on screens, though this time robots from the Spider-Man universe rather than toys from the films of Buzz and Woody. The land would feature some counter-service food options, some retail, and beyond these, the 6-acre space was arranged to hold 2 show areas, one of them a high-flying stunt spectacular above the buildings, and the other an effects-centered magic show featuring Doctor Strange in the ancient sanctum. Like Galaxy's Edge, the campus itself is arranged to suggest that the space has history. It includes a Stark Motors building which appears to be 80 years old, and suggests that the campus has grown out of the life and inventions of Tony Stark's father, Howard Stark, who apparently in the 1940s built an automotive factory in California. The building in this storyline was converted to hold the Web Slingers attraction. Officially, the attraction is staged as an open house, showcasing recent technology, the Spider-Bot, which then replicates at a disturbing rate and escapes out into the city. Guests moving through the attraction on ride vehicles need to catch them. At least in outline, this land follows the Galaxy's Edge playbook. The less expensive of the 2 proposed attractions would function like a video game merged with a dark ride. In Galaxy's Edge, this is Smuggler's Run, which uses a high-rate game engine to pair movements of the Millennium Falcon with screens and game action performed by guests inside the ship. In Web Slingers, the attraction pairs advanced movement tracking similar to the Wii with a dark ride experience. And as with Smuggler's Run, the underlying game system should significantly outperform anything gamers can experience at home. Quote, because we can track guests' hands and where their eyes are, Imagineer Scott Drake said, we can project webs in real time into a virtual immersive scene brought to life with the help of Panasonic 3D laser projection. In essence, your body becomes the shooter. A tracking system will monitor your arm movement and hand gestures along with your facial position, and based on that, an image will appear on screen as though you are launching the webs from your wrist into the 3D world managed by the video game engine. Imagineer Casey Ging would later explain that the system, quote, actually registers the movement of your wrists, elbows, your shoulders, and head 60 times a second, so you can actually just point and sling webs just like Spider-Man. If all works well, once you are wearing those 3D glasses, the web solution should appear to connect seamlessly from your arms into the video world projected on the screen. Exactly what the web solution is, I'm not sure. In Spider-Man's original comic book appearance in Final Fantasy from 1962, he makes his web from, surprisingly, hardware supplies. In one panel, Peter Parker, when trying out his new Spider-Man tech, says, quote, with some strong liquid cement at the end, I can pull myself anywhere with my little web. In a far more recent comic book iteration of Spider-Man's origins, in Ultimate Spider-Man from 2000, Peter Parker invents his web materials from a formula left behind from his deceased father. After testing it, he says, quote, we did it, Dad. to the memory of his lost father. I've been staring at your formula for the molecular adhesive you were working on before I could read, and I could never finish it for you. But of course it was now finished. And that's a continuity issue. Two different versions of the same story. Or think of it through this question. In Marvel, what is the real story and how does that relate to what is in the parks? The idea of canon and continuity will function differently in Avengers Campus than they do elsewhere in the parks. Disney in this area has a very different approach to Avengers Campus, but we'll get into that more in the next episode. To get back to the topic at hand, the Web Slingers ride is going to be a little more in line with Smuggler's Run, with a second attraction later filling out the area. The centerpiece e-ticket attraction, initially described as a Quinjet journey into Wakanda, has been delayed in part due to the pandemic and unofficially due to the tragic death of Chadwick Boseman, the star of the Black Panther film and representative of Wakanda, as it's unclear if Black Panther, as an ongoing film series, will be able to retain a high level of popularity without its star. And so I'm guessing that Disney will likely need to wait to see how the stories of Wakanda perform at the box office without Boseman before they commit to a specific storyline for the second attraction. But this second attraction, for both the California and the Paris parks, was the experience that was arranged to anchor the area, much like Rise of the Resistance anchored Galaxy's Edge. Remember that half year in which Smuggler's Run was the only attraction in Galaxy's Edge, and all of those complaints about Galaxy's Edge, mostly that it functioned as an outdoor retail mall with some restaurants and just one ride. And then remember how all of those complaints went away when Rise of the Resistance opened? I'd expect for some of those same elements to play out here, only there will be a much longer gap between the opening of the Web Slingers attraction and the Quinjet adventure than there was between Smuggler's Run and Rise of the Resistance. This generally has been the Disney strategy with these single IP lands for a while. Pandora has Flight of Passage, an e-ticket attraction, plus Na'vi River Journey, a supporting attraction. Galaxy's Edge has Rise of the Resistance, an e-ticket attraction, plus Smuggler's Run, a supporting attraction. Cars Land has Radiator Springs Racers, an e-ticket attraction, and two supporting attractions. The headliner typically features new ride technology and a deeply immersive experience. Though there have only been a few announcements about the Avengers e-ticket ride once slated for this campus, Scott Drake described it as a Quinjet experience in which each traveler is able to move in a unique direction, taking off from Avengers Campus and heading to Wakanda to join other Avengers in battle there. Quote, "After your individual flight," Drake said, "you'll then rejoin the action in Wakanda, where a battle on an epic scale will take place. As seen in the concept art, guests will actually move around in the attraction in their own individual seats as part of the aforementioned individual flight aspect of the attraction." Again, I suspect that Disney will wait and see how successfully Marvel Studios can redirect the Black Panther films without Boseman before deciding on the location for the gameplay. But the underlying ride technology is intriguing. Seats that allow guests to individually move through a 3D video game-like environment, presumably with some onboard controls. That type of ride system, with new footage, could be adapted for various experiences. But of course, this ride isn't in the campus yet, nor will it be for years. So when I go to Avengers Campus, I'm going to keep that in mind. There was originally an intended delay between the first and second ride, and the pandemic and the death of Chadwick Boseman has extended that gap possibly by many more years. Also, some show elements, such as a full stunt show, likely can't be performed presently as that would create a crowd. The Spider-Man show, which in previews lasted about a minute, was unannounced, like a cavalcade parade out in Florida. I'm guessing that this was likely not the original concept for the show. Then again, this is only a guess. The unannounced quick format does bring a sense of spontaneity to the area. But to get back to the topic again, when The Land is finished years from now, Web Slingers will likely be more in line with Smuggler's Run or Navi River Journey than the centerpiece e-ticket designed to anchor the whole area. And lastly, like Galaxy's Edge, The Land contains sub-biomes with localized themes. The industrial urban landscape engulfs the Web Slingers building and the PIM test kitchen. But adjacent to this urban landscape are a set of ruins, which are configured as a staging area for a show focused on illusions featuring Doctor Strange. But events here most likely will be limited in an attempt to reduce crowds, much in the way that parades and character greetings have been pared back elsewhere in the park. But the issue that I want to focus on before I hit up the parks and walk through the land is how the inclusion of Marvel, particularly in this new land-based area, will change the narrative tones of Disneyland. There are narrative tones and traditions in the world of Marvel, and there are tones and traditions in the Disney parks. These do not line up in a few important areas. In this section, I want to take a look at how Marvel will change the long-held storytelling traditions at Disney, and also how the traditions of a Disney park will change some long-held traditions with Marvel. And to do this, I'm going to refer to how Spider-Man appears in both the comics and films. So this is your advanced warning. If you are about to read a bunch of Spider-Man comics from the 1960s through 2010, you might want to click off this podcast right now, as we're going to explore plot points from some of Spidey's best-known stories and how these issues will reshape Disneyland. For me, though I read Marvel comic books when I was a kid, the Star Wars and Disney worlds were more familiar touchstones as I grew up. But about a year ago, when one of my kids started to get interested in Marvel comics, he's in junior high. I figured this would be a good opportunity for me to better familiarize myself with both the comics and to understand how their stories might work within the Disney parks. In this, there will be a meshing of complex traditions, and this likely will be a messy thing. As I mentioned earlier, Disney will almost surely tone down the language, violence, and sarcasm for the in-park presentation of Marvel characters. That's been the plan at the Hong Kong park, where Marvel presently has 2 rides. But beyond this, Disney will no doubt ignore some of the storylines in the comics, which can have very strong adult themes. Even in the early years, Spider-Man took on difficult issues: the war in Vietnam, trauma related to combat, drug addiction, and the civil rights movement. Avengers Campus is based on the movies, but Avengers Campus also won't share the exact same world as the MCU films. More on that next time. Avengers Campus will likely pick up some elements from the comics as well, as Marvel artists, not just Marvel Studios, offered input for the land and its rides. Think of it this way. Galaxy's Edge isn't solely based on the Star Wars films. There's also Lothcats and Hondo Anaka, both of which were culled from elements beyond the films. But in terms of meaningful change, there are fundamental storytelling differences between the culture of Star Wars, Disney, and Marvel. These elements will expand the storytelling space inside the Disney parks. And as in today's episode, we're mostly focused on the Spider-Man attraction, I'll mostly focus on how the story of Spider-Man is and is not like other stories that have been absorbed into the Disney parks, in the films, the TV shows, and the comics. Today we'll look at how the narrative goals central to Marvel will change the tones of a Disney park experience. And then in our next episode, we'll talk about some other issues, such as a unique approach to canon and interconnectivity that will change storytelling rules in the Disney parks as well. And some of these ideas go back to the inception of major Marvel characters. In the 1960s, teenage superheroes in comic books were relegated to the role of sidekick, such as Robin in Batman. Stan Lee, an editor and writer at Marvel, disliked teenage sidekicks as they were always deferential to an adult lead. Instead, he wanted to create a teenage superhero who faced the complexities of young life directly. A superhero who was somewhat of an outsider, a kid who was bullied who also faced problems at home. His powers would come from a spider bite, granting him skills like web-slinging and unusual strength. Lee's publisher, Martin Goodman, said, quote, "That's the worst idea I ever heard," which caused Lee to shelve the concept for a while. But he kept coming back to it, intrigued by its narrative materials, the psychological realism of a coming-of-age novel dressed up in a superhero adventure. Lee would also explain that he, quote, "fought so much to give this idea a chance." At that time, Marvel published an anthology series of short stories in comic form called Amazing Fantasy, with stories directed at older readers, different characters every month. As sales remained low, the publisher decided to drop the series, but as it was going out of print, Lee was able to include the teenage superhero story in its final issue. Quote, "Nobody cares what you put in the last issue of a book you're about to drop," Lee said. Or to put this another way, in a separate interview, he explained, quote, "I sneaked him into the last issue of Amazing Fantasy." Lee himself specialized in story and character development, while others at Marvel specialized in character design and arranged the art. Initially, Lee asked Jack Kirby to rough out character designs for the young spider hero. Kirby had worked on the Fantastic Four and more recently the Hulk. He was a master of communicating story through visual elements. His panels were typically laid out so that each line related an element of personality or a narrative turn. But he was also drawn to more powerful figures and monster villains than what Lee imagined for his teenaged superhero. In Kirby's hands, the spider hero was arranged with lines that presented strength and confidence similar to the drawings of power he regularly produced for other Marvel titles. Quote, "What he did was good," Lee explained, "but it wasn't what I wanted." Lee then asked artist Steve Ditko to redesign Spider-Man. Ditko was a decade younger than Kirby. 10 years earlier, in 1950, Ditko had come to New York to learn how to draw comics. He worked for a variety of publishers, and in the early 1960s, he was still dividing his time between Marvel and Charlton Press, mostly to work on fantasy titles. In Ditko's hands, the confidence in Kirby's initial drawing was replaced with vulnerability and a sense of awkwardness. In Kirby's hands, the character looked like a superhero who happened to be a teenager. But in Ditko's, a teenager who happened to be a superhero. The changes in design shifted the areas of emphasis. The story and art they created about a boy bit by a spider at a science hall was placed into the final issue of Amazing Fantasy, with an image of Spider-Man swinging between buildings on the cover. Odds were that the comic would be ignored and soon forgotten. But unlike other issues of Amazing Fantasy, this issue with the spider hero on the cover sold well. The issue also prompted fan mail and an Alley Award, that is, an early award for comics, for the best short story in comics for the previous year. The response was strong enough that Martin Goodman, who had previously opposed the Spider-Man concept, suggested Lee begin a series based on his young hero. Before the Fantastic Four, most superhero stories had been arranged as battles between heroes and villains. But as Spider-Man moved into production, Lee wanted this character's experience to radiate personal struggles. Quote, "I wanted him to have a lot of problems," Lee said, "like that he doesn't have enough money. Spider-Man, aka Peter Parker, struggled with girls and sports and with popular kids at school. These problems then evolved into a universal story about adolescence. Adolescence is a period of significant changes. Bodies grow and become stronger. Teenagers have new skills, new insights. Teenagers often explore issues of identity, who they are and how do they relate to others, and they have a stronger sense of individuality. Teenagers often have difficulty explaining who they are, especially as these changes are happening. And they often struggle to create intimate space where others understand their new identities. In developing Spider-Man, Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, perhaps without fully realizing it, created a character who, because of his new powers and abilities, would explore the problems that face teenagers in a way each concern was amplified, so that the ongoing story felt like a mythic version of adolescent change. To put it one way, teenagers relate to Spider-Man because his superpowers force him to confront experiences they face in their own lives, only with more significant barriers and consequences. To put it another way, Spider-Man as a character isn't interesting because he has unusual powers. He's interesting because his superpowers can't solve his problems as a teenager. He's bullied at school. He struggles with self-confidence and romantic relationships. He and his Aunt May continually face money problems, even to the point of nearly losing their home. But even with his unique powers, he can't overcome these obstacles. In the comics, over many years, Peter Parker, aka Spider-Man, goes to high school, then goes to college. He grows up, he gets a job. For a while, he's a photographer at the Daily Bugle. But in later comics and retellings, he teaches chemistry in high school. He becomes a research scientist. And in Ultimate Spider-Man, though he tried to become a photographer for the Daily Bugle, he's hired to manage their web page, as that was a more valuable skill in the early 2000s. Outside of work, he gets married, struggles with real-life concerns, and then, for a lack of a better phrase here, separates from his wife MJ. But in the movies, he's almost always a teenager in high school. Plot-focused big-screen entertainment is almost always most effective when its stories approach the materials of myth. That is, stories that illustrate a central truth about human experience in such a way its meaning has unique clarity. The ongoing tragedy in Spider-Man's life is that his family and friends repeatedly are punished or killed because of the good that Spider-Man tries to accomplish. The best-known example of this is with Uncle Ben. Uncle Ben's plotline is played out, or at least referenced, in most of the movies and TV adaptations. Though the events play out in different ways in various films and comic book retellings, the basic narrative is this. Because Peter Parker, with his new abilities, doesn't stop a criminal, that criminal remained free and later shot his uncle, the central father figure in his life, a tragedy that Parker would forever blame on himself. The lesson, as Uncle Ben once put it, is this: with great power comes great responsibility. In the comics, these tragedies continue as a series for years. Though in later issues, most of the TV shows and most of the movies, with the exception of those starring Andrew Garfield, the story of Spidey's life focused more on his relationship with MJ. The early comics are far more focused on Peter Parker's romance with Gwen Stacy, a romance that played out over years with her father, a revered captain on the New York police force. Gwen is first introduced in issue 31 as a friend of Harry Osborn, a girl who quickly stands up for herself, and though she enters the world of Spider-Man with the young playboy Harry, she soon becomes the regular love interest of Peter Parker. 59 issues later, her father dies in part because Spider-Man tried to defend New York. In the film version, Amazing Spider-Man, it's played out as a battle between Spider-Man and the Lizard. But in the comic book, it's a battle between Spidey and Doc Ock. The Doc's mechanical arms crush part of a high-rise, and as stones tumble, Captain Stacy rushes in to save a child, only to be crushed himself. Captain Stacy, who is aware of Spider-Man's true identity, in his final moments asks him to look after his daughter. Quote, After I'm gone, there'll be no one to look after her, no one, Peter, except you." Spider-Man, while holding his dead body, asks, "Why must it happen? First I lost Uncle Ben those long years ago, and now the second best friend I ever had." This would be a question he would carry unanswered until the next tragedy in his life, which arrives a couple years later in issue 121. In that issue, Norman Osborn, feeling powerless as he watches his son Harry relapse into addiction and as he watches his business struggle with financial concerns, twists into a fit of rage, again becoming the Green Goblin to confront his old nemesis Spider-Man. If the world was going to give Osborn pain, he was going to hand that pain off to others, specifically Spider-Man. As the Goblin, Norman Osborn kidnaps Gwen, then uses her as bait to lure Spider-Man into a negotiation. "Your presence in this world has been a source of constant agony to me," he tells Spider-Man. "I wish you to leave it permanently, or else Gwen Stacy dies." The struggle that ensues ends when the Goblin pushes Gwen off the support tower for the George Washington Bridge, where she falls headfirst toward the water and cement below. Spider-Man, using his web as a silky lasso, catches her ankle. For a moment, he believes he has saved her, just as he's done for dozens of people in the past. But in the next panel, in the space next to her shoulders, in a single word, snap. And with that, Gwen Stacy dies of a broken neck, in part from Spider-Man trying to rescue her with his web. In 1973, when this issue was published, no reader thought that a central character, especially Gwen, who provided the romance that led Peter to trust himself, would disappear from the comics. In the comics, superheroes experience loss when they are young, to shape their sense of morality and empathy, and to direct how they use their powers. Batman's parents are killed during a mugging in front of Bruce Wayne as a boy. Superman's parents die as their home planet is destroyed, after sending him on a spaceship destined for Earth. And of course, there's Uncle Ben. In the traditions of superheroes, ongoing tragedy wasn't part of their ongoing story. Tragedy was part of their origin story, but ended there. But that's not what happened in Spider-Man. In Spider-Man, the comics became real, forcing Peter Parker to face tragedy in a manner outside of the traditions of early superhero stories, particularly those at DC. The event was also a turning point for MJ, who until this moment was presented as a party girl inside of Harry's group of friends. The death of Gwen Stacy forced her to turn inside to examine the brevity of life and also how she might help her friends not simply have a good time. This was the moment that years later set her up as Peter Parker's next romantic interest. But with Gwen's death, Peter Parker has the answer to that question he's struggled with for years. Why do people around him suffer? The answer he finds is simple. They suffer as the direct or indirect result of him being Spider-Man. Gwen was targeted to influence Peter. Captain Stacy died because Peter couldn't manage Doc Ock. If Peter wants to save his friends with confidence, he needs to stop being Spider-Man. But if he stops being Spider-Man, others in the city will die because he's not there to protect them. It's an equation he works out with clarity. Save hundreds in the city or save a few people close to him. His answer is to more fully hide his identity from everyone, even Aunt May. In the comics, Peter and Aunt May don't talk about his superhero identity for the first 40 years of the story, until 2002. In this, Spider-Man's story is one that can't have a happy ending unless Peter stops being Spider-Man, which will come at a cost to hundreds of strangers. The best example of this dichotomy comes from a far more recent story, from the Civil War arc in the comics. If you've only seen the movie version, you'll need to wipe away the MCU narrative for a moment to understand how the comic, which is played out in crossover issues and tie-in books, is assembled. In my opinion, it's a far better iteration of the story than the one that was related on screen. In the world of Marvel, many storylines are an exploration of contemporary politics, which is certainly true of the Civil War arc, which was published in 2006 and 2007, and explores post-9/11 themes of freedom and security. The story begins as a set of sea-level superheroes, with a reality show tracks some supervillains to stage a fight, largely to improve their Nielsen ratings and audience share. Only it goes terribly wrong, with the villains, all with criminal records, blowing up a neighborhood in Connecticut and killing hundreds, including kids at a school. As a result of this tragedy, in which kids died, to regulate those with superpowers, the U.S. passes the Superhero Registration Act, in which superheroes need to register, receive training, and become government employees to use their powers. Leading the pro-registration effort is Iron Man, as he believes the only other option is that the government will criminalize the use of any superpower. His company also stands to gain millions by building a detention center strong enough to hold those with unique powers. Leading the anti-registration effort is Captain America, who believes that conscripting superheroes as government soldiers will make them act with political interests rather than with moral concerns. Spider-Man is caught in the middle. In terms of plot development, Peter Parker is forced to choose between two core values that have guided his life, laws which he believes have been arranged by those older and wiser than him, and the protection of Aunt May and MJ, who at this point is now his wife. Peter initially chooses to side with Iron Man, yet another father figure who has taken the place of Uncle Ben, who himself replaced Peter's father. But as Peter Parker watches tones of authoritarianism and profiteering enter the group that gathers around Iron Man, he decides that he's picked the wrong side. But by this time, the entire world knows that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. There's a long list of criminals who would like to enact their revenge. At the top of that list is Wilson Fisk, the Kingpin, a New York crime boss who orders a hit on Parker. If the gunman can't get Parker, he's told to shoot family members. The Civil War event is arranged in different storylines. Toward the end of a side narrative arranged as Civil War: The Amazing Spider-Man, the story ends as the gunman moves in on the hotel where Peter is hiding out with Aunt May and MJ. The gunman centers the crosshairs of his rifle on MJ and then Aunt May. The final panel of the comic shows Aunt May fallen to her knees, touching blood that has emerged from a fresh wound on her chest. From here, the story continues in the One More Day arc. There's a twist or two involving Mephisto, the devil, and other terrible choices that Peter Parker must make. But most of this story so far illustrates the main concept about how Marvel plots are different than those arranged by Disney or even Star Wars. In the typical Disney animated feature, characters such as Snow White overcome troubles and eventually reach a point where they live happily ever after. In Star Wars, once the Death Star is destroyed, celebration rings out across the galaxy. And though this is not a universal, indefinite happiness, it initiates the end of war and a type of peace that lasts years. But in Marvel, trouble is always present. Moreover, for characters to do good acts, they must absorb tragedy in their personal lives. As long as Spider-Man is a hero, some will want to hunt him and his friends down. Tragedy comes to Peter's friends because he tries to help others. There's no possibility for the type of happy ending that defines narratives over in Fantasyland. Even if these aren't the stories related in the park, these are the life stories of the characters who will find a home in Avengers Campus. And even with the toned-down language and subject material, the Marvel narratives, by their nature, will introduce more mature and sophisticated stories into the Disney parks, stories focused on continual struggle, where characters, so long as they remain true to themselves, are not able to reach a moment where they no longer face adversity. Okay, I started working on this episode on Monday. It's now Thursday. Avengers Campus opens tomorrow. I'm going to head over to the park and see it for myself. I'll also record some audio. I have some other narrative areas that separate the storytelling traditions at Marvel from those at Disney and the parks. Marvel has a very different way of thinking about canon than Disney or Lucasfilm, and Imagineering has been attempting to integrate some of MCU's interconnectivity into the park areas. We'll continue our exploration in a few days, again outside of our usual Sunday schedule. But I wanted to post up this episode today, so that if you're going over to Avengers Campus this weekend, you might have some new ideas to consider as you move through the shows and rides there. If you enjoy this podcast, please support us by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. We're an ad-free, listener-supported show. We simply wouldn't exist without the generosity of our subscribers. The best reason to join is to support the research and work we do here. But on Bandcamp, you'll also find exclusive episodes that have never appeared on iTunes or elsewhere on the web. You can join at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link in the show notes. Until next time, this is Todd James Pierce.